In the previous lecture, we had a chance to consider a contemporary puzzle within the theory of knowledge, namely, whether it is rational to decide to pursue an experience based on your imagination of what that experience is like. That puzzle concerns, in part, the limits of a certain kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge, or knowledge of what a certain experience is like. There are other types of knowledge as well, the most important of which, traditionally for philosophers, being factual knowledge. In this lecture, we'll briefly survey various types of knowledge before beginning to focus in on factual knowledge in particular. In doing so, we'll also begin to see some of the features of factual knowledge that make it particularly significant in our intellectual lives. Significant enough to have been a topic of philosophical study for literally thousands of years. I mean it when I say philosophers have been studying knowledge for thousands of years. In fact, one of the writings on knowledge that is still read today was written around 369 BC. In other words, just about 2,400 years ago. It's one of Plato's Socratic dialogues, the Theaetetus, in which Plato has Socrates discuss the nature of knowledge with some young Athenians, among them the nobleman Theaetetus, who gives the dialogue its name. As with many of the Socratic dialogues of Plato, the character modeled on the historical figure of Socrates begins by asking the young men with whom he's conversing to define some philosophical term, in this case knowledge, and then proceeds to make them look like complete idiots while they thank him for the privilege of talking with him. Close to the beginning of this dialogue, for example, Socrates asks Theaetetus to give an initial definition of knowledge, and Theaetetus replies that he thinks that the sciences like geometry are knowledge, and he would include the art of the cobbler and other craftsmen. These, each and all of them, are knowledge. Now, Socrates continues by mocking Theaetetus, not because these aren't good examples of knowledge, but because Theaetetus offers examples rather than a definition, which is what Socrates is after. What's interesting for our purposes, however, is that Theaetetus's answer already gives us examples of at least two, if not three, distinct kinds of knowledge. One kind of knowledge is one that philosophers call know-how. It's the knowledge that cobblers or other craftsmen have. They know how to make shoes, or pilot a ship, or cure disease, all cases that Plato uses as examples in his Socratic dialogues. A second kind of knowledge is one that philosophers and linguists call knowledge hua. It's knowledge who, what, where, or why. In other words, it's the knowledge that enables you to answer a who, what, when, where, or why question. Perhaps Socrates is hoping that Theaetetus has this kind of knowledge, the knowledge that would allow him to answer what knowledge is. The third kind of knowledge is factual knowledge. It's knowledge that a certain fact is true. Philosophers often call this kind of knowledge knowledge that, or propositional knowledge. It's called propositional knowledge because when you say, I know that it rained yesterday in downtown Seattle, philosophers call the part of the sentence, that it rained yesterday in downtown Seattle, a proposition. If you want to sound technical, you could say that propositions are the contents of that clauses. As I mentioned, Socrates scolds Theaetetus for giving examples of knowledge rather than a definition. And what follows in the dialogue is a consideration of a number of different definitions. As the conversation progresses, Socrates abandons any discussion of the different types of knowledge, like knowledge how, or knowledge who, what, when, or why, and pretty much focuses exclusively on propositional knowledge. This focus is actually typical of most philosophical discussions of knowledge. Almost all of them have traditionally focused on propositional or factual knowledge, what we also called knowledge that. We'll follow that philosophical tradition and focus on propositional knowledge in many of these lectures. But don't worry, we'll also discuss know-how as well. We'll save that discussion, though, for another lecture. I'll spare you further discussion of the ins and outs of Socrates' criticisms of the various attempts at defining knowledge by Theaetetus and his colleagues. It is worthwhile, though, to mention the definition that Plato settles on at the end of the dialogue. Although he's not completely satisfied with it, Plato, speaking through the character Socrates, arrives at a definition of knowledge as true belief with logos, where logos is the Greek word meaning a reason or an account. Those other two components in Plato's definition of propositional knowledge are still present in the most widely accepted accounts of knowledge today. In order for something to be propositional knowledge, it has to be both true and a belief. Of course, you can know that something is false. For example, I know that it is false that 2 + 2 = 5, and I'm pretty confident that you know it too. But then what we actually know, the claim that 2 + 2 = 5 is false, is itself a true claim. Now, as we'll see, it will be no easy task to cash out what we ought to add to true belief to fully characterize knowledge. It's this question that has posed the most serious difficulties in discussions of knowledge in the last 2,000+ years. However, what ought to be striking to you right now, it's certainly striking to me, is that Plato was pretty close to an analysis of knowledge some 2,400 years ago. Though I can't help but hold Plato's achievement in awe, there are some reasons for thinking that it is, in certain respects, not surprising at all that someone even thousands of years ago would be able to approximate a correct account of knowledge. In fact, there are some reasons for thinking that achieving a correct understanding of knowledge is child's play. Here's what I'm getting at. There's a great deal of evidence from developmental psychology that the ability to recognize instances of beliefs and knowledge in others is a fundamental ability for children. The ability to recognize beliefs and knowledge is, in fact, essential to what psychologists call a child's theory of mind, their ability to use reasoning about other people's mental states to explain and predict their behavior. Research into the development of theory of mind in children has exploded since the 1980s, in no small part due to the initial work of the Austrian developmental psychologists Josef Perner and Heinz Wimmer. Their very first experiment, published in Cognition in 1983, is a good example of the sort of research design that has yielded such fruitful experimental results. In that first experiment, Perner and Wimmer had children from 3 age groups, ages 3 to 4, 4 to 6, and 6 to 9, watch a puppet show involving a boy named Maxi. While the children watch the puppet show, a storyteller describes the scene as the story unfolds. Maxi is in the kitchen with his mother. The kitchen has 2 cupboards, blue and green. The children watch as Maxi puts a piece of chocolate in the blue cupboard, after which they see him leave the room. As Maxi leaves, the storyteller emphasizes that Maxi remembers where he put the chocolate and that he is looking forward to eating it when he returns to the kitchen. While Maxi is gone, the children see his mother take the chocolate out of the blue cupboard, use a bit of it to bake a cake, and put the remaining chocolate in the green cupboard. A short time later, the children see Maxi return to the kitchen and are told that he wants to eat his chocolate. At this point, the experimenters asked the children the belief question. Where will Maxi look for the chocolate? In the initial experiment, Perner and Wimmer found that none of the 3 to 4-year-olds, only 57% of the 4 to 6-year-olds, but 86% of the 6 to 9-year-olds answered the belief question correctly. Furthermore, those who answered the belief question incorrectly committed a systematic error. They assumed that Maxi will look for the chocolate in the green cupboard as opposed to the blue one. One initial suggestion for this striking result might be that the children themselves either no longer remembered where the chocolate was or no longer remembered where Maxi initially put the chocolate. However, to rule out such alternate interpretations, Perner and Wimmer asked the children two additional questions. First, the reality question, where is the chocolate really? And second, the memory question, where did Maxi put the chocolate in the beginning? Even those children, including the 3 to 4-year-olds, who answered the belief question incorrectly, answered the reality and memory questions correctly. That is, the children knew where the chocolate was and they remembered where Maxi put the chocolate. But many of them, including all of the 3 to 4-year-olds, failed the false belief task. This experiment has now been reproduced numerous times with strikingly consistent results. The standard interpretation of the results of such experiments is that children at the age of 3 to 4 years are unable to attribute to Maxi the false belief that the chocolate is to be found in the blue cupboard. Furthermore, the widely accepted implication of this result is that children at the age of 3 to 4 years are unable to form beliefs concerning the false beliefs of others. One reason why the results of the false belief task are particularly significant is because of a connection they suggest between understanding belief and understanding truth and knowledge. It turns out that children's abilities to make sense of belief develops at about the same time as their abilities to understand what it is to deceive someone intentionally. This would suggest that children begin to acquire a more sophisticated understanding of the meaning of truth at this stage. Furthermore, it is also at this time that children develop the ability to recognize the connection between a person's sources of information and that person's knowledge. For example, in his 2012 book, Trusting What You're Told: How Children Learn from Others, the Harvard developmental psychologist Paul Harris spells out a number of ways in which children between the ages of 3 and 6 begin to be sensitive to which informants are knowledgeable. As Harris argues, even newborn children look to adults to gain information both about their environment and how to act. At the earliest stages, however, children base their trust on social and emotional cues. Am I familiar with this adult? Do I already have a positive emotional attachment to them? Beginning in the preschool years, however, in that crucial transition from ages 3 to 6 that Wimmer and Perner also explore, children begin to search more for evidence of accuracy and reliability when deciding who to trust. Was the person in a good position to perceive the event they're reporting about? Have they been accurate in the past? Do they use names for objects that I'm familiar with in the way that I expect that they should? Wimmer and Perner offer a good summary of these connections. They note that, quote, a novel cognitive skill seems to emerge within the period of 4 to 6 years. Children acquire the ability to represent wrong beliefs and to construct a deceitful or truthful utterance relative to a person's wrong beliefs. Within this period, several other related abilities also emerge. Children start to understand another person's absence of knowledge. They become able to construct a deceitful utterance and to infer a deceptive plan from a critical utterance in the context of conflicting goals. What this suggests to me is that Plato was onto something when he suggested that the notions of belief, truth, and knowledge are intimately related. Something that is in some ways so basic, even children intuitively appreciate the connection. So Plato's 2,000-year-old theorizing and contemporary developmental psychological research agree. There's an intimate connection between knowledge and true belief. This analysis of knowledge as involving true belief faces a significant challenge, however. There's a very commonly held notion that belief, being by its nature a subjective, individual representation of reality, is incompatible with objective truth. In fact, contemporary society seems to be full of controversies that rest on different perspectives on the fundamental objectivity of truth. In a 2017 essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education entitled Teaching Humility in an Age of Arrogance, the University of Connecticut philosophy professor Michael Lynch criticizes the idea that there is no such thing as truth. he puts the argument against the notion of objective truth in this way. Quote, "There is just no way of escaping your perspective or biases. Every time you try to get outside of your own perspective, you just get more information filtered through your own perspective. As a consequence, objective truth is just irrelevant. Either we'll never know it, or it doesn't exist in the first place." Unfortunately, though Lynch does not endorse this argument against the relevance of objective truth, he does not, in his essay, explain what is wrong with the argument. Now, to be fair to Lynch, he's more concerned with arguing in favor of intellectual humility and an openness to evidence. However, it is a shame that he doesn't debunk the argument against objective truth. It's one that seems to be very appealing to many people, perhaps because they associate the notion of objective truth with dogmatism or close-mindedness. That association, however, is a mistake. In fact, the idea that it's possible that we could be very confident and believe ourselves to have very good evidence, but nevertheless be mistaken about the truth, is the very opposite of dogmatism. But that possibility is exactly what objective truth guarantees. So arguing for the notion of objective truth serves Lynch's broader goal of making the case for intellectual humility. Before we go into detail about where the argument fails, I should point out that the quote from Lynch really contains not one argument, but two. One argument begins with the idea that we always only have access to information from our own subjective impressions, and then concludes with the claim that objective truth doesn't exist at all. Let's call this one the inexistence argument. The other argument also begins with the idea that we always only have access to information from our subjective impressions, but this argument concludes with the claim that we'll never know objective truth. Let's modify the conclusion of the second argument from Lynch's quote slightly. We'll have plenty of time to discuss knowledge in subsequent lectures, so let's make the argument's conclusion that we'll never grasp objective truth. I don't think that this modification really affects the point of the argument. The argument doesn't seem to me to be one about knowledge at all. It's really about truth and its inaccessibility. So let's call this second argument the inaccessibility argument. Let's begin by returning to the inexistence argument. This is the one that attempts to establish that objective truth doesn't exist from the idea that we only have access to information from our own subjective impressions. The problem with the inexistence argument is that it involves a pretty obvious non sequitur, which is a fancy way of saying that the conclusion of the argument doesn't follow from its premises. In the case of the inexistence argument, the glaring problem is that how we access information has no bearing at all on whether or not truth exists. To appreciate this, consider an analogous argument. Suppose I argue that since architectural photography always only records information from the subjective impressions of the photographer, buildings don't exist. Ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what the inexistence argument attempts to do in the case of truth. So the inexistence argument fails. There is no reason at all to think that objective truth does not exist, even if, for the sake of the argument, we grant that we always only have access to our own subjective impressions. We'll allow then for at least the possibility that truth exists. For our purposes, we may characterize truth as involving a certain kind of state of affairs. For example, a state of affairs consisting of a claim and something the claim is about. And to continue the example, what it is for a claim to be true is for what is claimed actually to be the case. So the claim, Washington wintered at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778, is true just so long as Washington really did winter at Valley Forge in 1777 to 1778. So to refresh your memory, the other argument against truth, the inaccessibility argument, begins with the idea that we always only have access to information from our own subjective impressions, and then concludes with the claim that we'll never grasp objective truth. The point of the argument seems to be that the fact that we have subjective perspectives is incompatible with our accessing or grasping objective truth. The problem with the inaccessibility argument, however, is that it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of what truth is. Far from being incompatible with subjectivity, one could argue that truth can't do without subjectivity. Consider our characterization of truth before. What it is for a claim to be true is for what is claimed actually to be the case. Well, what is a claim? It's something that some individual person makes. There can't be a claim without someone claiming it, even if they're only claiming it, say, for the sake of argument. States of affairs, however, are not claims. They are ways that the world is, and as such, they are independent of claims. States of affairs, then, are objective and independent of anybody's thoughts or claims. Claims, on the other hand, are subjective. They are acts, speech acts, that an individual person performs. So what it means for something to be true always involves a subjective component. And what it means to grasp an objective truth is simply to endorse a claim that is true. For our purposes right now, we can treat beliefs as on a par with claims. Roughly, beliefs are claims that you endorse silently to yourself, or claims that you would endorse silently to yourself if they were brought to your attention, or claims that you would endorse publicly if they became a topic of interest. So if our argument shows that the subjectivity of claims is completely compatible with our ability to grasp objective truth, then the argument should equally show that the subjectivity of beliefs is completely compatible with our ability to grasp objective truth. In other words, rather than its being incompatible with the subjectivity of belief that we grasp objective truth, our grasping objective truth always involves an aspect of subjectivity. There's one more argument that we should consider. The argument has been proposed in slightly different versions by a number of thinkers, but the version that we'll now consider is that offered by the philosopher Richard Rorty, who taught at Princeton and the University of Virginia, among other places, and was a winner of a coveted MacArthur Genius Grant. Rorty begins by noting that whenever we ask ourselves whether some claim is true, we answer that question by looking at the evidence that we have for thinking that it's true. Then, he continues, if that's the case, there's no way to determine truth independently of our evidence. So he suggests truth is irrelevant. All that we really ought to concern ourselves with is our evidence for endorsing a given claim. We'll see in later lectures that there are reasons to question the premises of Rorty's argument. For now, however, we don't even need to do that. This is because the biggest problem with Rorty's argument is that it is again a non sequitur. As with the inexistence argument we considered before, in Rorty's argument, the conclusion simply doesn't follow from the premises. You can see this most clearly by considering how Rorty is thinking of truth for his argument to work. In order for the argument to work, the only use of truth can be when we ask ourselves whether something is true. But this is not the only use. Suppose I want to know not whether I think something is true, but whether someone else thinks something is true. And once you consider those sorts of cases, it's obvious that grasping the truth and having evidence for the truth can come apart in either direction. That is, sometimes you can tell that someone happened upon the truth, but they believe it on the basis of not very good evidence at all. At other times, you can see that someone thinks that they have good evidence that something is true, but you can tell that it isn't in fact true. Now, a lot of people are nervous about cases where they claim to know something is true, while someone else who thinks they have good evidence is wrong. Their nervousness comes, I think, from immediately jumping to problem cases, like arguments about hot-button topics like politics or religion, or scientific topics that have been colonized by those hot-button topics, like global warming or child vaccinations or evolution by natural selection. Don't worry, we'll tackle some of those topics in later lectures. For now, though, I'd like to deal with the mundane sorts of cases that will do just enough to show that Rorty is mistaken. Remember the Wimmer and Perner experiment that we discussed earlier in this lecture, where the children were shown a puppet show? This is precisely the sort of case that is extremely common and that Rorty completely ignores. Here's a real-world example that's unfortunately all too common at my house. I like to put cereals away on the same shelf every day so that they're easier to find. When she's in a hurry to go to work, my wife sometimes takes out a box of cereal and leaves it on the breakfast table. Suppose one morning my 6-year-old son sees me put the cereal box away where I normally do. Then I go out of the room to shave before taking my son to school and then going in to teach. While I'm gone, my wife comes into the kitchen, takes out the cereal box, pours some cereal, eats it, leaving the box on the breakfast table, and then runs off to work. Here's what my son knows. First, Dad believes the cereal box is on the shelf where he left it. Second, Dad has good evidence for thinking the cereal box is there because he remembers putting it there. Third, Dad's belief is not true because while Dad was out of the room, Mom left the cereal box on the breakfast table before running off to work. As Wimmer and Perner's experiment showed, and as literally hundreds of other experiments since theirs have confirmed, the ability to reason like this is a sign of intellectual and conceptual maturity. The problem for Rorty's argument, however, is that reasoning like this requires that you distinguish between grasping the truth on the one hand and having evidence on the other, even having what appears to you to be good evidence. So Rorty's argument for the irrelevance of truth fails as well. To recap, there are different kinds of knowledge, including know-how, knowledge who, what, where, when, and why, and factual or propositional knowledge. Of these different kinds, philosophers have traditionally focused mostly on propositional knowledge. Furthermore, there are good reasons for thinking that all propositional knowledge involves true belief. And finally, there is no reason for thinking that common concerns about objective truth should bar us from thinking that objective truth is a component of knowledge, along with belief. Remember, however, that Plato's definition of knowledge involved more than just true belief. It involved logos, a reason or an account. Relatedly, the developmental psychologists we discussed also distinguished between merely believing something true and knowing it. They mentioned the importance of qualities like accuracy or reliability for having knowledge. In the next few lectures, we'll try to gain more insight into what knowledge is over and above mere true belief. And in doing so, we'll canvass a number of influential philosophical discussions of how to turn true beliefs into knowledge.